The late afternoon sun in Atlanta, Georgia, had a way of turning the humid air into a thick, golden syrup that clung to the leaves of the towering oaks lining the streets of Inman Park. Inside the Miller household, the atmosphere was slightly less serene. Sarah Miller, an architect whose mind was usually occupied with structural integrity and aesthetic flow, was currently trying to navigate the structural integrity of her 10-year-old daughter Emily's science project while simultaneously preventing 6-year-old Ben from using his sister's glitter as magic fairy dust on the living room rug. Tom, Sarah's husband and a high school history teacher, walked through the door, his bag heavy with ungraded essays. He caught Sarah's eye, a silent communication of shared exhaustion and enduring love. The Battle of Hastings was easier to manage than this kitchen, he joked, gently lifting Ben away from the glitter. Their life was a whirlwind of deadlines, school runs, and the constant hum of a young family. But beneath the surface of their busy lives, a quiet tension had been simmering. It wasn't about their work or their children, but rather the well-meaning but overbearing influence of Sarah's parents, Eleanor and George Peterson. The Petersons lived in a beautifully restored Victorian home just outside Savannah, a place of moss-draped trees and slow-moving rivers. They were the quintessential grandparents, loving, generous, and deeply invested in their grandchildren's lives. However, their investment often felt like a hostile takeover. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, the video call would start. Eleanor's face would fill the screen, her eyes immediately scanning the background for any signs of disorder. "Sarah, darling, is that Emily's science project? It looks a bit haphazard. You know, I always found that a more structured approach yielded better results. And Ben, is he still wearing that superhero cape? It's nearly bedtime. He should be in his pajamas." George would then chime in from his armchair, his voice a low rumble. "Tom, I was talking to my friend Arthur at the club. He's into some very interesting commercial real estate in North Carolina. You two should really consider diversifying. That teacher's pension is fine, but you need real assets." Sarah would feel her jaw tighten, her carefully constructed architect's calm beginning to crumble. She loved her parents, but their constant stream of advice felt like a critique of her life. It wasn't just about the science project or the pajamas. It was about the fundamental right to make their own choices as a family. That night, after the kids were finally asleep, Sarah and Tom sat on their back porch, the sound of cicadas a steady rhythm in the darkness. "I can't do it anymore, Tom," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with frustration. "I feel like I'm 35 years old and still being treated like I'm 15. I love them, but their help is suffocating us." Tom nodded slowly. "I know. It's hard because they really do mean well. But we're the ones living this life, not them. We need to find a way to tell them that without breaking their hearts." Sarah remembered a TEDx talk she'd seen by Sari Gilman called "Good Boundaries for You." The title had stuck with her. She'd always thought of boundaries as walls, but Gilman argued they were more like gates. They allowed you to decide what came in and what stayed out. She also thought of Nedra Glover Tawwab's work on family dynamics. Tawwab emphasized that setting a boundary isn't an act of aggression, it's an act of self-preservation and relationship building. If they didn't set boundaries now, the resentment would eventually poison their relationship with Eleanor and George. "We need to have a talk with them," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. A real one. Not a defensive reaction during a phone call, but a calm, planned conversation. They spent the next few days drafting their family constitution. They identified the areas where they felt most intruded upon, parenting decisions and financial choices. They decided that their goal wasn't to push Eleanor and George away, but to invite them into a different, more supportive role. The following weekend, they drove down to Savannah. The air was cooler there, scented with salt and pine. They sat in the Petersons' sunroom, the light filtering through the stained glass. "Mom, Dad," Sarah began, her hands folded in her lap. "We wanted to talk to you about something important. We love you both so much, and we're so grateful for everything you do for us and the kids." Eleanor smiled, but her eyes were wary. She could sense a shift in the atmosphere. But Sarah continued, "We've realized that for our family to grow the way we want it to, we need to take full responsibility for our decisions. That means when it comes to how we raise Emily and Ben and how we manage our money, we need to be the final word. George started to speak, but Tom gently intervened. George, your financial wisdom has been a huge help to me over the years. But Sarah and I have our own goals and our own way of reaching them. We need you to trust that we've learned from you and that we're capable of navigating our own path. Eleanor looked hurt, her eyes welling up. Are you saying you don't want our help? That we're not welcome in your lives? No, Mom, not at all, Sarah said, reaching out to take her mother's hand. We want you to be the best grandparents in the world. We want you to spoil them with stories and cookies and trips to the park. But we need you to leave the parenting and the planning to us. It will actually make our time together so much better because we won't be constantly arguing or feeling judged. It was a difficult afternoon. There were tears, long silences, and a few defensive remarks. But Sarah and Tom stayed firm and kind. They were setting the foundation for a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect rather than obligation. With the boundaries established, Sarah and Tom felt a newfound sense of agency. They decided to take a deep dive into their financial life, inspired by the resources Sarah had been researching. They read an article about money lessons rich parents teach their kids. It wasn't just about accumulating wealth, it was about the mindset of financial responsibility. They realized they hadn't been as intentional as they could be about teaching Emily and Ben about money. They started the Miller Family Bank. Each child had 3 jars: save, spend, and give. When they earned their allowance for chores, they had to decide how to distribute it. One Saturday morning, Emily wanted a new set of professional-grade markers. She looked at her spend jar and realized she didn't have enough. "Can I just have an advance on next week's allowance?" she asked, her eyes wide and hopeful. Tom knelt down to her level. "Emily, remember what we talked about? If you spend more than you have, you're borrowing from your future self. Why don't you wait another 2 weeks? By then, you'll have enough, and the markers will feel even more special because you earned them." Emily huffed, but she didn't argue. She was learning the value of delayed gratification, a lesson more valuable than any marker set. Meanwhile, Sarah and Tom were applying the same principles to their own lives. They read about parents saving millions for their children and realized that while they weren't millionaires, they could be much more strategic. They automated their savings, increased their retirement contributions, and started a dedicated college fund for the kids. They treated their family finances like a long-term project, with clear milestones and regular reviews. Back in Savannah, Eleanor and George were undergoing their own transformation. The initial sting of Sarah's boundaries had faded, replaced by a quiet reflection. Eleanor picked up a book by the Gottman Institute on how to be a grandparent without overstepping. She learned that her role wasn't to be a second mother, but to be a keeper of the flame, the person who held the family's history and traditions. She started a project, a Grandma's Kitchen scrapbook for Emily and Ben, filled with old family recipes, photos of Sarah as a child, and stories about their ancestors. When they visited, she didn't criticize their behavior. She told them stories about the time their mother got her head stuck in the banister, or the time their father tried to build a rocket ship out of cardboard boxes. George, too, found a new way to connect. He remembered the 5 heartfelt questions you must ask your father before it's too late. He realized that he hadn't shared much of his own inner life with Sarah. During their next visit, George took Sarah for a walk along the river. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice soft, "I never told you about the time I almost lost everything in my first business venture. I was so afraid of failing you and your mother. That's why I've been so insistent about your finances. I didn't want you to feel that fear." Sarah stopped and looked at her father, seeing him not as a source of unsolicited advice, but as a man who had faced his own struggles. "Thank you for telling me that, Dad. It means a lot to know where you're coming from." 2 years later, the Miller and Peterson families gathered for Thanksgiving at the house in Atlanta. The atmosphere was light, filled with the smell of roasting turkey and the sound of children's laughter. Emily was showing her grandmother her latest architectural drawing, a treehouse of the future, while Ben was helping George carve the turkey. Both of them wearing matching aprons Eleanor had made. Sarah and Tom stood in the kitchen, watching the scene. There was no tension, no underlying resentment. The boundaries they had set hadn't built a wall. They had created a garden where everyone could flourish. "You know," Sarah said, leaning against Tom, "I think we finally got the structural integrity right." Tom smiled, kissing her forehead. "And the aesthetic flow isn't bad either." The oak tree of the older generation and the saplings of the new were no longer competing for space. They were rooted in the same soil, reaching for the same sun, their branches intertwined in a beautiful, complex, and enduring dance of love and respect. They had learned that boundaries aren't about keeping people out, they're about letting the right things in. They had learned that financial independence isn't just about money, it's about freedom. And they had learned that the greatest wisdom a grandparent can offer isn't advice, but the gift of their own story, shared with love and without expectation. As the sun set over Atlanta, casting long, purple shadows across the yard, the Miller family sat down to dinner. They were a family that had learned to listen, to respect, and to grow together, yet each in their own magnificent way.